Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Be the Vessel, a space of channeled learning, intuitive wisdom, listening, receiving, and open-hearted communication from me to you, from spirit to me to you, for whenever you may receive this. My name is Daniel, and the topic I am going to speak to today, I am guided to speak to today, is of the higher self. Now, let me say right off the bat that some of these topics, my more egoic mind, my thinking mind, is more familiar with based on my own experience, training, learning, studying in the traditional sense. Though other topics, getting into the more spiritual realm, my thinking mind is less familiar with. Like higher self is a concept that I've been sort of studying spiritually in my own way, listening to my guides about, consulting with healers about as it arises in my journey, learning from picking up context clues from spirit about. With that said, I don't know it as, or I should say, I don't think it as concretely in the thinking mind. So this dips more into a channeling process where what comes through about this concept may be partly what I think and partly another form of wisdom that can and should always be filtered through your heart space, through your intuitive knowing. I guess it's all to say you don't have to take this as absolute truth. I mean, no topic I speak to, even if it's something I've studied more concretely, should you take as with 100% certainty unless it lights you up. It's only my truth and the truth of the wisdom I am surrendering to that it comes through. And words can be faulty. Higher self, that's one way of describing something, an experience, but the experience itself is never the words. So allow this to be a loose interpretation or communication of this idea. So I've spoken before, not on this podcast, but I likely will do one on this as well. I've written a lot and elsewhere I speak to the idea of the child self, which you're likely familiar with if you've been on a healing path. There's a lot of popular sort of, the word calling it a trend feels a little dismissive, but things do get a little trendy in the healing space. And one of those trends is inner child work. And it's not to say that working with your child conditioning is trendy. It's just that the language and the labeling of it becomes trendy. Like someone may ask you, oh, I'm doing inner child work, or tell you, or ask you, have you done any inner child work? And it's like, well, what do you mean? It's not, is it a brand? Is there one healer you go to who does that? We call things by many different names. And there's different ways, there's multiple paths to heal. But when you hear people becoming a bit more rigid or stringent about the particular things you need to heal in order to walk the spiritual path, you can be skeptical. That may be what works for them. But, when you read the plethora of spiritual teachers or those who have walked the path, who have awakened, who have expanded, did every single one do it the same way? No, none of them did, in fact. I do value inner child work. I don't necessarily call it that, but it's a valuable component. Anyway, so I've been guided to speak to that. Again, this comes more through intuitive wisdom, but I've been guided to speak to that more as the lower self, you might say. The lower self, or like the body self, the embodied self, literally lower in the body, because that's where it seems to show up. And I've heard this validated from others who I've worked with, particularly in the lower chakras, like the root chakra, where there's a lot of power, but there's also a lot of fear conditioning. And a lot of that fear conditioning comes from primal survival-based strategies, though primal and survival-based strategies learned as children. And from the perception of the child mind, navigating the world, and then internalizing and conditioning a lot of those beliefs, and actually wiring the nervous system and the energetic body to hold on to a lot of this, what you might call trauma, or frankly, just conditioning. And so that is a very, personally, I would say it's a necessary component to this work. But again, someone else might just wake up and not need to address those child hurts and pains. Maybe they all dissipate when you just rise to a certain frequency. It's similar to people who say you need to make sure you're clearing away dark entities or spirits and be on the lookout for that. And it's like, well, maybe, but others may just go toward the light and frankly not worry about dark energies or spirits, or really even have to be in that world at all. So, cultivate your own truth and knowing, so you don't feel like you have to get pulled into so many different directions. With all that said, working with what I might call the lower self is important. The child self, the child needs, this is the crux of all clinical psychological theory and work, really. And so there's a lot of value in that, in the gut space, and then even up to the heart space, sort of the child self as it's imagined or visualized in you can direct you to where the blockages are. And that's where I begin with a lot of clients and in workshops and things like that. People who have no sort of exposure to intuitive wisdom, I will guide them there, because usually there's a lot right on the surface that's ready to be acknowledged and to be healed. And I'm wondering why I didn't do a podcast on that at first, because I'm talking so much about it now. But once we start to work with that a little bit, you start to develop a relationship with the child self. Maybe you see some imagery, maybe you get some knowing, maybe you start to feel the emotions that have been stored and disavowed, and start to get a little bit of clarity around that. Not that this has to be a linear process, but that's usually where I start. We can then begin to call in the higher self, which I will describe in this moment as the part of you that collects the whole of your soul's journey, all of your karmic incarnations. And this gets, into some information that's sort of beyond my thinking mind, but not just your incarnations, but all the incarnations of sort of the multiverse layers of your soul. So if you think about your soul sort of splitting off and playing out different lives in different dimensions, I know this is getting a little bit sci-fi, but consider the very real possibility that there are multiple universes, that there are multiple dimensions, and that your soul is not just playing out this life right here, but actually multiple lives. Um, and since time is really not linear, I mean, this is factual, that they may actually be playing out simultaneously. I know, like, mind blowing, but consider that. Um, you don't need to really do anything with that information. And if it doesn't resonate with where you're at, just let it go. But consider, for the sake of this, the unfolding of this idea, that the higher self is the part of you um, which resonates innately at a higher frequency because it's a non-physical being, a non-physical part of you, entity, um, uh, will always guide you true, has your highest interests, I can't say at heart, because I don't think they have a physical heart, but maybe an energetic heart, at heart, or in mind, in spiritual mind, and collects within its sort of energetic and karmic and sort of soul DNA all of the incarnations of all aspects of your, all sort of breakaway paths of your soul. And so, as it is the hub for all of this information, like the supercomputer of all of who you are, it has the most information on all of the lessons that you've been learning and all that you are meant to learn in this incarnation, in this life, in this dimension, on this planet Earth. So, with all that said, it's a pretty good entity to check in with and to call in. And I find you can do it. Well, I can speak from my experience and those who I've worked with. When you call on the higher self, they do come through. You know, the idea of people hearing guides and things like that, that's begun to happen for me, but for many, there's a lot of doubt and fear. Anyone, I believe, all can do it. But there's a lot of doubt and fear conditioning that gets in the way. But with the higher self, there seems to be an easier access way or entryway or path. Similar to the child self. The child self seems to come through very clearly and quickly for most, because it's just right there on the surface. And it seems that one step beyond that or alongside that, the higher self comes through. It's a part of you. I think that's probably why. And it tends to provide more light-based information, visions about where you're going and, your highest truth, rather than say like the blockages in your way, which is a lot of what the child self may be showing you because there's a lot of fear conditioning from being a child. So the higher self may reveal, the possibilities of where you can go and where you're really meant to go. So it can be a very beautiful piece and entity, source of wisdom. It's a good way to describe it. A beautiful source of wisdom to call in. And you may begin to hear them. They may speak to you. They may just show you imagery in meditation. And you can make a practice out of it because they're there. I guarantee they're there. They're with you every step of the way. They are you. And as you practice calling them in, it can become more integrated to the point where you begin to feel them and feel their insight rather than having to hear them like you're hearing me. You may hear and feel them within you as if it is you. It is more of a merging that may take place over time. That's sort of what's begun to happen to me. So less of a need for like a direct conversation, a back and forth in that sense, more of a trusting and an innate knowing that happens more simultaneously by frequently calling this figure in. Now, this may get into a bit of like technicality, but your spirit guides typically are going to be at higher frequencies, higher levels of consciousness, closer to the light source energy, closer to God status in a way. With that said, they may not all know the intricacies of what it's like to be human. The higher self will know this, has all this information on you, your lessons, and all of that. Um, Attempting to describe the entity, the source of what that is, any more than this would be getting into territory which, frankly, I'm unfamiliar with, and also is not necessarily needed. I think the important point of this is to say that there is a source that is there for you that you can call in and practice playing with, hearing from, listening to, envisioning, allowing yourself to be a vessel for what they send you and show you and light the way. It's a beautiful source to strengthen your intuition, to check in with on big decisions. And it may be a natural step in the evolution and expansion of your intuition because it will feel close. The wisdom will feel close to you. It will come to you in a style and maybe even tone of voice that you're familiar with. It won't feel so alien, so to speak. And in that sense, it can be a gentle voice to begin hearing that resonates close to your own. A lot of when we start to get into this stuff, it can feel like, how do I know I'm not just making it all up? It's a big question. I've had that thought many times. And the truth is, your conviction grows from experience, from witnessing experience. Spirit will reveal things to you, signals, signs. Your guides will say things to you that then come true. And you're just like, oh, this has happened enough times, or there's been enough serendipity or synchronicity that I am believing it. And just the energy within you will know. There is a knowing. There's just a deep knowing, and that knowing comes along with a real light and joyfulness. And and you can sort of see it unfold in your life. And so you don't have to take my word for it. It's only an invitation to begin practicing and to sort of presencing you, allowing your awareness to expand to this idea that this is a resource for you, someone to call in. And this is a less popular form of healing, not as trendy because it's not as accessible to the traditional clinical world. Inner child work is it's a metaphor. Obviously, there's not a real little child living inside you unless you're pregnant, in which case that's not your inner child. But the metaphor is more accessible to the clinical world because a lot of the clinical psychological world is based on theoretical orientations that already speak to us as children, and the metaphor of that, including parts work and internal family systems, it's a very natural integration and probably one of the most integrative sort of bridges between the clinical world and quote unquote the spiritual world. There's a big overlap there. Inner child work is spoken to in both ways. Calling in the higher self moves you a bit further on the spectrum toward more holistic, more alternative, more spiritual, more energetic practice. Though in my own practice and in my work with others, the lines are, there's not a big gap, if any gap at all, between connecting to either parts of self or calling them in. So play with it, experiment. If you haven't done anything around this, then I may do some more experiential videos to guide you, though I would start with focusing on the heart space and then calling in the child self and seeing how that goes. Though if you want to go for it, go for it. I'm not someone who feels the need to prescribe a certain way to walk this path. I tend to be a risk taker and to take leaps, and so, and I don't get the sense that there's any sort of risk in calling in the higher self. The higher self really has your highest and best interests in their mind, spiritual mind, so energetic mind. So play with it, see what happens. With all of these things, it's really ultimately about healing fear and doubt, healing the thinking mind, because that's what gets in the way of all this practice, all of this foundational intuitive wisdom, all of this hearing and listening. So it's really about entering a safe, peaceful, blissful, energetic, meditative state. And there's a way that I do that. And the way that I tend to guide that, it has evolved a little bit over time. And maybe I'll do a bit of an experiential process on one of these episodes, but or you can watch probably some of my other videos online. But yeah, it's I think it's a good foundational source to play with and to call in and to allow to guide you on your path. So may this piece of light source wisdom be a gift, a medicine, and an invitation to all who are ready to receive it. Thanks for tuning in. Take care.